Hi, so welcome to section 9. This section is going to cover tariffs. If you're watching this section video before midterm 2, I just want to let you know that this section isn't going to be included on the midterm, so please don't worry if you're watching this before midterm 2. Again, it won't be included. So far in this course, we've been focused on why countries trade and the overall gains that countries can achieve by engaging in free trade. But we've also seen that trade may create both winners and losers. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn our attention to the ways that governments are going to seek to influence trade through the use of trade policies such as tariffs, quotas, and subsidies. Such policies may be used in an attempt to increase the country's overall gains from trade, to increase the gains of winners, or to decrease the losses of losers. But the first and most important trade policy that we're going to consider is going to be import tariffs. And so it's often easiest to analyze the case of a specific tariff, which is going to be a fixed surcharge collected on each unit of a good that's being imported regardless of the price. So for example, if the price is P, then a specific tariff would raise that price by T. And so the resulting price of the good in the sort of local economy would be P plus T. But practically speaking, we usually see tariffs implemented as ad valorem tariffs, which are taken as a percentage of the value of imported goods. And so if the tariff is T here, the total price of the good for consumers would be P times T. But regardless, both types of tariffs have analogous effects. And so in this section, we're going to first consider the case of a small open economy. When we think of a small open economy, we think that their policies cannot affect the world price. And so they're just going to take the world price as given. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to just set up a fairly standard supply and demand diagram. And so here, what I'm going to think about is I'm going to think about the sort of domestic market for one good. Let's call it wheat, but it doesn't really matter what it is. The supply and demand curves that I've drawn, I've labeled them as domestic supply and domestic demand. And that's going to be a little bit clearer in a moment. But again, we're just going to think of all of the supply that's available for one product in a country and all of the demand that exists in a country. So to start out, we're going to take PW. That's going to be the world price as given. And so we start out with PW right here. And then my country is now going to decide to apply a tariff. And again, we're going to think of that as a specific tariff. And so that's going to increase the world price by T. And so from the perspective of domestic consumers and of domestic producers, the new price is going to be P world plus T. Why is that? Well, that's, we could decide to import wheat from the world at a price of PW, but then we'd have to pay a specific tariff T on each unit of that. And so from the perspective of domestic consumers, it doesn't really matter whether or not I'm sourcing from abroad or from domestic suppliers. They all will sell to me at a new price of P world plus T because the government is applying the tariff now. And so the amount demanded that I have by consumers is basically where the new price intersects their demand and following that down to along the y-axis. And so that gives me QD, that's the amount that consumers demand with the tariff. Now, with the tariff, suppliers are going to be willing to supply more than what they were willing at a lower world price. And so domestic supply increases. And so now with this specific tariff, what we have is that suppliers are going to sell QS. Okay. And so now what I can do is just in the case of this tariff, I can think of labeling a couple areas here and thinking about what they mean for consumers, producers, and then the government. So note that the amount of imports that I'm going to have here is going to be the distance between QS and QD. Note that QD is larger than QS, and so if domestic suppliers aren't supplying as much as domestic demand, then the difference between the QS and QD must be made up by imports. Okay, and so that is how we figure out the area that we're importing. And so now if we know the amount that we're importing, notice it's the distance between QS and QD. So that's the amount of imports that we have. And we're importing all of those goods at a price PW and then apply a tariff T. Then how much revenue does the government get? It makes T dollars of revenue times the total amount of imports. And so this area right here that I'm shading, this is going to be my government revenue. Okay, so that's the first step in thinking through where all of this surplus goes to. So now, next, let's consider consumer surplus. And so consumer surplus is going to be the area between domestic demand and then the price that consumers pay at. So if I want to think about consumer surplus, it's this whole triangle here. Note that it extends beyond domestic supply because consumers are able to consume goods that are imported. And so this whole area here is going to be consumer surplus. And note that you can see that, if we're just looking at this area here, consumer surplus would have been much larger if we were able to consume at just the world price. And so note that the fact that we've applied a tariff, you can already see results in a reduction in consumer surplus. So next, let's suppose that the government, which was applying initially a specific tariff of T, reduces that specific tariff to a lower one of T prime. Well, what is going to happen to the amount that's going to be demanded and supplied by consumers? Well, the first thing we can note is that the new lower price caused by the reduction in the tariff is going to result in domestic consumers being able to consume more because now they're able to consume at a lower price. And so now the quantity that consumers demand goes from QD to QD prime. Likewise, now the reduction in the tariff has resulted in an effectively lower price for domestic producers. And so now the amount that is supplied domestically shifts from QS to QS prime. And so as a result, we've had demand increase and domestic supply decrease. And so now we have a larger amount of imports that are happening. And so that makes sense because when we reduce tariffs, now imported goods are cheaper. And so we'd want to import more of those goods. And so now what we can do is we can analyze this situation from the perspectives of producers, consumers, and the government. So recall that initially I said government revenue was this whole shaded area because the government was applying a tariff on of T on all of the imports. But now, when we have a decrease in the tariff to T prime, we have that now we have more imports, but we're applying a smaller tariff. And so as a result, the new government revenue is given by this shaded area right here. And so as you can see, it's sort of unclear whether or not government revenue has increased or decreased. We've lost this box right here. We sort of lost this sort of counter shaded box right here. This is what we've lost. But we've gained these two boxes right here. So for the government, whether or not we've increased or decreased revenue is going to depend on the size of these boxes. And so we can calculate those, but that's going to be important. So that was the government situation, and we'll calculate the area of those boxes in a bit. But at first, let's consider the situation of consumers. So at first, what we had that consumer surplus was given by this shaded triangle right here. And so, now, for the perspective of consumers, the consumers can now consume at a lower price, given by P world price plus T prime. And so now if consumer surplus was this triangle, it's just going to increase to also include this sort of larger triangle here. And so now consumers are going to gain because they're going to be able to consume at a lower price. So next, we're going to consider the case of producer surplus. And so initially, we have that all of the area between the domestic supply curve and the prevailing price is going to be producer surplus. But now, when we reduce the tariff to T prime, we've reduced the producer surplus to just this smaller shaded area given here. And so producer surplus is going to decrease when we reduce our tariffs. And so let's move on to the section slides where we'll see that, a little bit more. So moving back to the lecture slides, the first part of this is going to be, as I said, considering tariffs in a small open economy. And the section is just saying that all questions are going to ask us to consider a small open economy initially applying a tariff, T, that's then going to decide to reduce its tariff to T prime. So that's what's happened. As I drew on the whiteboard. The only difference here is that now we've labeled each of these triangles or boxes. So the question 1 is going to be what happens to the quantity of goods produced at home. And so the lower price now induced by the lower tariff means that domestic suppliers are going to want to produce less. And so if domestic suppliers were initially producing a quantity of 3, they're now going to produce a quantity of 2. So the correct answer here is that the quantity of goods produced at home is going to fall from 3 to 2. Next, we can think about what's going to happen to the quantity of imports. I already showed this graphically, but the quantity of imports, where it used to be from 4 to 3, but now domestic consumers can consume at a lower price, and so they can consume at a price P world plus T prime, and so they're going to consume a quantity of 5. Domestic suppliers are only going to supply a quantity of 2. And so the quantity of imports is going to increase from 4 to 3 to 5 to 2. And so the correct answer here is 3. And then question 3 is asking which of the following areas is going to represent the change in domestic consumer surplus due to the reduction in the tariff. And so recall that domestic consumers are going to gain, and so they're going to gain consumer surplus. And so they're going to gain basically the area between the price at which they consume at and their demand curve. And so when the price falls from the world price plus T to the world price plus T prime, that means that they're going to gain areas A, B, C, and D. And so the correct answer here is 4. Moving on, question 4 asks which of the following areas is going to represent the change in domestic producer surplus due to the reduction in the tariff. Okay, and so as we saw on the whiteboard, when we reduce the specific tariff from T to T prime, that results in a decrease in producer surplus. And recall that producer surplus is going to be the area between the domestic supply curve and the prevailing price. And so when we reduce our price from T to T prime, that's going to result in a reduction in domestic consumer surplus of negative A. To consider the change in government revenue due to the reduction in the tariff. Well, on the whiteboard, I said that we lose some part of, we lose the sort of upper box representing government revenue, but we gain 2 more boxes given that we're sort of now importing more. So we gain boxes G and I, but we lose area C. And so the change in government revenue here is going to be GI plus C. So answer 1 is correct. Okay, So now we want to figure out which of the following areas represents the change in total surplus at home. And um, and so what we're going to do is we want to add up all of the changes in consumer and producer and government revenue, and then that will help us figure out what the change in total welfare is. So remember that let's keep track of the changes in welfare for each of our agents. So consumers gain AB plus C plus D. Uh, producers lose A. So on net, if we add negative A and A together, we have that on net we have B plus C plus D. And then we have that the government is gaining G plus I plus C. So from before we had B plus C plus D. So now we have B plus D plus G plus I. And so that should be the change in total surplus at home. So number 4 should be correct, and it is. And so we can see that the government, by reducing the tariff, there's been a net gain in welfare. So it doesn't really matter how large B plus D plus G plus I are. There's nothing negative in that sum, and so we can see that on net it's positive. So for even though our domestic producers may be a little bit worse off, the gains of the government and of consumers mean that we're overall gaining from decreasing tariffs. And so, you might ask, given that the net gains are positive, why might the government choose to keep the original high tariff T rather than reducing it to T bar? And so there may be a couple answers, and so I'll go through all of these. One, tariff revenue might be easier to collect than tax revenue from other sources. Tariffs are just taxes imposed on consumers based on their sort of consumption of imports. And so it could be that tax revenue is easier to collect. You apply the tariff to goods that are coming in at the border, and that might be easier than, for instance, if you have a tax system that does, it's unclear whether or not people are reporting their income correctly. It could be that tax revenue is easier to collect than from tariffs. It is easier to collect than revenue from other sources. So that's certainly a possible answer. Number 2 says that the country's overall welfare is higher with the original tariff T than with the lower tariff T bar. So we've seen that that's not true. The country's overall welfare is definitely higher with the lower tariff T bar. So that can't be right. The deadweight loss is lower under the original tariff T than under the lower tariff T bar. So that's not true either. Deadweight loss is lower under T bar. But number 4 says that domestic producers are politically stronger than domestic consumers. And so that's certainly possible. As we've seen here, when the tariff is reduced, producers tend to lose. And so it could be that if producers are politically stronger, they lobby against tariffs, then it could be that they'd sort of help induce the government to keep higher tariffs. And so, indeed, the correct answers here are 1 and 4. Okay, and so that was tariffs in small open economies.